Hi, I am Kim with Imagine Scholarships, and I have Nikki with Huntington Learning Center. She's the director of Huntington Learning Center, and we are going to talk about all things SAT and ACT test preparations. So she is the expert here in the field, and we have a lot of questions here. It's going to be great for our students and family. So we'll just start right off the bat. General, general test question. Briefly explain the difference between SAT and ACT. Are there particular types of students that would benefit from one test over the other?
In the past, and by past, it's pretty recent, I would say the last couple of years, there have been a lot of changes to both SAT and ACT in the way that they're administered, the way the questions are formatted. When they were both fully paper-based tests, there were some very obvious differences between them. And I would definitely say that certain students would typically do a little bit better on one test or the other, kind of depending on their reading speeds and their math skills. Since SAT went digital, there were a lot of changes to the SAT itself. ACT is also now going fully digital. So these very recent changes have made a big a kind of boom and impact on high school students' lives and the way that they're used in colleges, and definitely the way that we have to prep for them. So ACT's new digital format is honestly being released this year. They're pushing it out in April. There have been a few like beta test style already, but the big push is in April of this year, whereas SAT went digital March of last year. Um, at this point, I don't know enough about the digital ACT since it's so new to really say that students should take one versus the other. Um, there's a lot of information online about the way that it's going to be set up and the way that things are scored. So ACT, they haven't made any changes to the way things are scored. SAT did make some changes. ACT's got some functionality on their online platform that SAT doesn't have. Whether it's good or bad is partly, I think, dependent upon the student, though. So I don't feel like there's necessarily a clear cut answer anymore as to this particular student with this skill set should take an SAT versus an ACT. Both tests are equally viewed when you take the test and you apply for college. So it's not like a college is going to say, okay, we want only ACT students versus SAT students. Either test is still fully applicable for the colleges. At this point, it's a little bit more about which online testing format do you prefer?
Okay. So I guess years ago, it's been a while since, like my daughter took the SAT test and she didn't take the ACT because
Mhm.
I guess 5 years ago or 4 years ago, one was more science based, analytical based, and one was
Mhm.
more English based. Is that still the case?
Sort of. So SAT has a reading and writing section that got like combined. So they used to be separate test sections. Now they're a combined section. And SAT used to have two like separated math sections, and they're now a combined section. So from a score base, SAT has a reading writing combo score and a math score. ACT does still have a reading score, a writing score, a math, and a science. So there still are four like distinct sections. But when they did the digital version, they changed some of the timing and they changed the number of questions that they're asking. So compared to the paper ACT, you now have a little bit more time per question on the digital test. And then I believe that they are making that science section more of an optional section. Now, that may be coming down the road a little bit, but they're making it more of an optional idea. So that way, students who are intimidated by it or don't feel like that's their strength, they don't necessarily have to take that portion of it. And another thing that ACT is doing that SAT is not is in September of 2025, ACT will have a paper version of this newly formatted test so that if you don't want to take it online, you don't have to. You can take it on paper.
Okay, nice.
Hmm.
Some people like old school versions and they need that paper, and some people like
Right.
digital. Okay.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And a lot of times the ACT science section would kind of scare students off because they thought that it was all about rote memorization of sciencey facts. That's not true. It's very much a reading comprehension under the guise of science like articles. So, yes, it's higher level reading comprehension. Yes, it's analytical skills, but it's not necessarily a I'm doing science math or I'm doing I have to know biology and chemistry terms and that kind of thing. If you had some of that information behind your belt, if you were a science minded person and the terminology didn't scare you off, then that section may be easier for you to handle than for a student who was very unfamiliar with that information. So, students who are headed into science fields, medical fields, that kind of thing, may have less difficulties taking that ACT science section just because they may be already more familiar with the terminology.
So what are the most effective study strategies for students taking both types of tests?
From a content perspective, they're very similar. They're not the same. So ACT does actually test on some math topics that are a little more advanced that SAT does not tackle either at all or very, very minimally. Um, but from a content perspective, they're very, very similar. So the students that we work with are almost 100% SAT. Part of that is just because of the way that tests are kind of talked about in different regions of the country. So for whatever reason, the South has a very SAT heavy population, whereas like the Northeast has a very ACT heavy population. Um, Again, both tests are equally valid, so I'm unsure as to why exactly one or the other is kind of pushed, but SAT is what everybody takes here. So it's pretty rare for us to actually get an ACT student. Um, but I get that question all the time, right? Should I take both? If I prep for one, does it help with the other? Um, does it help to do both tests and just see what happens, right? So, from a content perspective, they're very similar. They both test math skills from roughly pre algebra through algebra 2 with a tiny bit of trigonometry, a little bit more on ACT's end for that. They both test things like vocabulary and context. They test lots of punctuation skills, transitions, noun verb agreement. So, very heavy in things like technical writing. They both test things along the lines of identifying main ideas, using factual evidence to support your answer, using inferencing skills and deducing skills, that kind of thing. So, it's really like taking the biggest cumulative final you've ever taken
Okay.
because you're essentially being asked to pull skills from that sixth, seventh grade space through usually sophomore, junior year. And most students struggle with that because, well, you don't cumulatively use that every single year.
So what are some of the mistakes that students make when they're preparing for these tests, and how should they avoid them?
I think the biggest mistake is treating this test like they treat a test they take in school.
Okay.
So instead of putting in the amount of time that is needed to cover all of the material and properly go through it and either learn it or refresh or re-examine it. A lot of students try to take this test cold, thinking that, well, I'm an A student in school, I should be able to just do this. It's like taking any other test, and it's not. Other students try to prepare for it, but they crash course it. So they prepare the week before, or maybe even 2 weeks before. That I feel like is honestly the biggest mistake. Most students are very, very capable of doing well on this exam. It's that they don't practice, they don't find old practice tests. They don't look at questions the way they're formatted. Since the test went digital, SAT's website on College Board has several practice questions. They've got some practice, like filling practice tests on their app called Blue Book that you have to use. And it at least allows the student to get familiar with the way the test looks, the way it operates. ACT has some similar, things too out there for their students. So that way on testing day, you don't just walk in completely blind. That shock factor of, oh my gosh, I only have 32 minutes to do this section doesn't exist if the student has done it a few times and is exposed to that testing format.
Are there specific tips that can improve on a student's specific writing or essay skills that you could share with them for like math or reading, specific tips that you have?
Yeah, so from a reading writing standpoint, and mostly on SAT, just because that test is a little bit more prevalent in our area, um, it is so heavy in punctuation skills. And a lot of the high school students that I work with have shared with me that, well, I'm on a Chromebook and I can use Grammarly, or my teacher cares about my content and not my punctuation. So a lot of students really suffer on the technical writing piece of that SAT because they're just not used to using comma rules properly, or they don't know the difference between dashes and semicolons and things along those lines. So read. When you're reading, you are exposed to lots of new vocabulary words. Utilize that, make a list, Google them later. You don't have to stop it exactly right then. But if you find a word you're unfamiliar with, use your context clues. Another thing that SAT is very heavy on is utilizing those context clues. And then just pay attention to that kind of punctuation, right? When you see big, long paragraphs, how are thoughts connected? How, which words are they using? Are they using things like periods and a capital letter for a new sentence? Are they using commas and conjunctions like and, but, for the fanboys, so to say? Um, as you're reading, pay attention to those kinds of things. That is the biggest helper. However, that really is a public service announcement for students who are in junior high or barely starting high school. If you are a junior and you are taking the SAT your junior year and you start to read for fun that year, you need to read for fun a ton because you have a lot of catching up to do. So yes, that's a really good tip and things. However, it is not, it's a long-term tip. It is not a short-term tip. In the short term, don't just accept all of Grammarly's suggestions when you're making emails and you're typing. Really pay attention to what the suggestion is and go, okay, I typed out this sentence and they're telling me I need commas or something like that. Look at it, pay attention, use some methodology that you may or may not remember. Things like if you have pairs of commas, then that information between the two commas you should be able to pull out and have the sentence still make sense. If it doesn't, something is wrong with your punctuation.
I think that's great advice. I think we've gotten used to the AI generated edit mode on our phones. It
Absolutely.
does it for us. And I think kids have gotten used to that. That's great. That's excellent advice, especially
Hmm.
with the upcoming test season with juniors just in a few months. So I think that's great advice. Test day advice. What do you suggest or advice for kids taking the test like on the day of? What's your advice for that? And how do you manage, how would they manage, the day of test?
Oh, absolutely. So I give test day advice to all of the students who come in through Huntington and work through our exam prep program. And obviously, these students have a very thorough exam prep program for them and their strengths and weaknesses. So they get a lot of different advice along the way. But I also send out like mass test day text messages, good luck, please do these things, not just to the current students, but to students who may have not actually used our services, but inquired about them in the past. So I always talk about, right, get a good night's sleep. That one's one of those that everybody says, right? Eat breakfast. All of the things that everybody kind of knows and talks about are very, very solid advice. But also things along the lines of leave earlier than you expect, right? What happens if you get stuck in traffic? What happens if you get out to your car and your gas tank is empty or you have a flat tire? You don't want to leave your house with, okay, it takes me 20 minutes to get there. I'm leaving 20 minutes from the time I'm supposed to be there, right? Get there a little early, plan to have some additional time. It allows for any of those goofy things we don't expect to happen and for you to deal with it. And it also allows you to get to that testing site, which, at least in our area, is mostly high schools. It allows you to get there, to park, to get in, to get to your seat without that stress of, oh my gosh, I have 1 minute until my test starts. You want to have that kind of feeling before you have to take that test. Um, Also on test day, even though SAT has an embedded online calculator, I always highly suggest taking your own calculator too. Make sure you have fresh batteries in it, because a handheld calculator can be a really nice lifesaver for you. ACT also has a similar thing. You can take a calculator there too. Um, Bring your own scratch paper, bring your own pencils. Your testing center should have these things for you, but in case they don't, you have them. You need to have the ability to take notes and have scratch paper, even on a digital test. Um, Control what you can control, right? So you can only control the time you get up, what you have for breakfast, how, your drive to your testing center. You can only control that so much. If there is something that happens before your test day, you have to be able to go, okay, that's fine. This thing happened. There was a car that slammed on their brakes in front of me and it made me all cranky and mad, but it doesn't matter. It's test day. Get to your testing center, sit in your seat, get yourself checked in, and just take 30 seconds, breathe deeply, right? Do some yoga poses or something, and allow yourself to get into that testing zone, right? It's your time to shine, and don't let all of the things that are out of your control hone in on you. Sit down, be confident, and say, you know what? I've got this. This is my day to shine. I do not need anybody messing that up.
Excellent. Excellent advice. How should students interpret their scores in relation to college admissions?
So that one's a little tricky. ACT has not made any changes to the way that they are scoring their tests with this new digital format. They still have a top score of a 36 and have said they've made zero changes to the way that you earn that scaled score. SAT has made some changes. Their range of scores is still the same. So their top range is still a 1600, which is the same as it was before. And that's really good for colleges because then that way the colleges can still say, okay, we accept a 1250 or higher without having to worry about changing that scale based on the new testing formats. So from a college entrance perspective, the way the universities are looking at it is if you took a paper test or a digital test or whatever, it doesn't matter because the scored output is of the same scale. And so you're still comparable to all of the other students that took that test. From a student's perspective, the digital SAT has made some pretty big changes the way that they get to your score at the end. So they had this new module system where you start with the test, you start in that reading and writing section, and however you perform on that first module puts you into either module 2A or 2B next. And it's an immediate transition. You finish that first set of questions, you are immediately put into the next set of questions. It does not tell you if you got into A or B or anything like that. You just go from one set to the other. Then you have a little break, and then you do the same thing for math. You start in the first math module, and then how you perform there puts you into either 2A or 2B. And again, it's an immediate progression. You don't have a break or anything in between. After your test has been taken, you get scores back in roughly 2 weeks. And you'll be given a scaled score overall, right? So here is your 1110. And here's your breakdown in math. Here's your breakdown in reading and writing. And then SAT will give you a little bit of, they'll never tell you if you got into 2A or 2B, but it'll say, okay, here are the content areas that you were tested over. And here's like a progress bar, right? So you got 3 out of 5 progress bar pieces correct uh, information ideas, for instance, or maybe you got 2 out of 5 in geometry or something to that effect. So they give you a little indication of your strengths and weaknesses on that score output. The way to utilize this is if you get a score that is not competitive, is not what the universities are averaging, is not what they're looking for scholarship opportunities, and you need to retake your SAT. Utilize the output that College Board gives you with those little progress bars to at least give you some direction as to which content spaces do I need to put more effort into, especially if you went into this test cold and you didn't study for it at all. Um, Also seek out prep, right? Test prep services are very abundant. Some are much better than others, some are more thorough than others, but a lot of students have a really hard time just going over the immense amount of material required for an ACT or an SAT. And prep is generally needed for at least some sort of guidance, if not actually teaching and relearning some of these skills for a lot of these students.
Right. Now, they only have to submit one test, right?
That kind of depends on the school.
Okay.
So, for instance, if you have a university that you're applying to that does a thing called super scoring, then you need to take the test at least twice,
Mhm.
because that allows that university to super score it. And super scoring happens in one of two ways. One way is that the university says, I want you to submit your best math and then your best reading, typically from two separate tests. Other universities will take your overall scaled score and they'll just average them together, but not over like 10 tests. So if you take it, lots and lots of times, it's not necessarily going to improve your possibility of acceptance. Um, but be careful because there are some universities out there who want only your best scores, and some who want every single score you've ever taken. So it's really very university specific. Um, Especially when it comes to super scoring, whether they do it or not, and exactly what scores that they're looking for.
Good to know. That's very good information. All right. So, how would you tell students to manage test anxiety? So, if you have a student come in with test anxiety, they're nervous, they've been prepping for months, how would they manage test anxiety, stress, you know, all the
Yeah,
things, and they go in, they're totally prepared, and then they're so stressed out about test anxiety. How would they manage that testing?
absolutely. So, well, for sure. I mean, a lot of my students come in with some form of test anxiety, whether it's just based on these larger tests that they feel like have so much importance to their future. Some students come in and they have test anxiety every single time they take a test, even during classwork. Um, the more you know about the test, whether it be ACT or SAT, the more you know about how it operates, the more comfortable you are with that format, that system, the more at ease you will be on test day. So that is one of the big things that we do here at Huntington is every student does, well, they start with a very thorough evaluation process, which puts them through an entire full length test. But then as they do their preparation with us, they also go through multiple practice tests because these practice tests are simulated test environments. They're proctored. They're run the exact way that a SAT or ACT would be on official test day. And that allows the student to feel the pressure of a test, but in a slightly more controlled environment. And it also allows them to experience what that feels like before it's for real. And so they can kind of get out some of those testing jitters. They can have that ability to feel comfortable with that test, comfortable with the timing, comfortable with what they're expecting, comfortable with the number of questions that they're being asked. So that's one handle of it. The other would be the how that student has prepared for it. How much content and knowledge base have they, actually gone over, and how much do they really understand? So I see students of both kinds. Some students come in and they have tons and tons of content under their belt and they really understand the material, but the timing of the test and their um, and exposure to it is really what throws them when they have to go to take it. And they get very overwhelmed and they get in their head, they start second guessing themselves, they rush or they take way too long on questions, and then they're rushing at the end. And so that entire process really sets their score up for failure versus success. Whereas I have students who really need a lot of content building because, for instance, COVID affected a lot of these students when they were in junior high. And so a lot of these high school students taking SAT right now are missing many key components that SAT tests because COVID affected their learning at that point. And so the students who really need the content building, we focus explicitly on content at first. And then toward the end, when it gets closer to their test day, then we really start to focus in on, okay, here are some strategies. Here's how you handle timing. Here's how you do your best to breathe through it, right? Control what you can control. Here's your guessing strategies, things like that.
So are there any other tools or resources? So we know that there's Huntington Learning Center. Are there any other online websites or tutoring programs or books or websites that help students prepare for the SAT or ACT program test prep?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are sites everywhere, to be honest. The first place I direct students would be to be the actual official sites of the tests, right? So either to go to collegeboard.org for SAT prep, or I think it's ACT.org for ACT prep. Both of those websites have um, official practice tests and practice questions in the right format that they'll be asked in. The College Board website actually has the students log into their College Board account so that they can utilize the Blue Book app, which is the app that you have to use when you take the test for real in the first place. So it gives you that very simulated testing experience. And since you're signing in as a student to your own account, you can kind of track your progress and things like that. So both of those websites are first and foremost because they are the creators of the tests. And so they are going to have the most information for you. There's also a plethora of other books and things you can either find online or you can go to the bookstore, right? Princeton Review, Kaplan. There are several very big name test prep companies out there that are continuing to be big name test prep companies. I caution students against let me buy the book from Amazon and have it sit on my shelf for 6 months, because if you buy the book, you have to use it. You can't just get it through osmosis. Um, some students who are really just looking for help in one or two areas, or who are very, very self-driven and are able to self-teach, those books are fantastic. Um, it depends a little bit on the style of how the book is set up as to whether or not it may be something that a student really like grasps and latches onto, since each of those test prep books are written in slightly different styles and formats. But if you are not a fully self-driven student, if you're a student who really needs interaction and take things out of SAT context and give different practice and give different examples, things like that, I suggest finding a person in some format. So there are, of course, in-center options like we do here at Huntington. There are lots of online options. I think Varsity Tutors is a pretty big one that I hear about too. But a lot of students are having issues with online format because during COVID, that is something that just didn't leave a very good taste in everybody's mouth. So some people are edging away from it for that reason and just not giving it a chance. Some students, especially students who have things like dyslexia, dysgraphia, ADHD, they may not be the best candidates for an online only style program, just because oftentimes you need to be a little more hands-on with how those students learn. But they exist. There are so many programs out there.
So other than the new virtual format for the ACT, are there any other recent changes or trends for the SAT or ACT that this student should be aware of? And what's the future of standardized testing for college admissions that you know of?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll start there. I think the future of standardized testing is in some ways just beginning. With having both of these tests making these very large changes into a digital environment, um, they're setting themselves up to be very comparable tests, just like they used to be. When SAT went digital and ACT was still on paper, there was this very big difference between the two. And now that they're both digital again, they're basically very comparable again. Um, During the COVID time, many universities didn't worry about whether or not you had an exam, right, an SAT or an ACT for acceptance. There are many reasons for all of that, of course, but essentially that was put on hold, that was put on pause. And so they would call this a test optional policy. And the test optional policy is basically saying that the university considers your application a completed application package without test scores. Okay. Now, over the last year and then moving forward, many universities, not all, but most of them so far, are reinstating the requirements for SAT and ACT. A lot of the push for that has come from, well, a couple of places. There are so many applicants each year right now, and only the same number of spots available. So it's become a more competitive environment in the beginning. Many high school juniors and seniors who are applying have very strong GPAs. And so your GPA isn't necessarily setting you apart from your peers and making you more competitive like it did, 10 or so years ago. Um, Also, a lot of these universities kind of discovered that during COVID and the few years after, the students that they accepted into their schools may not have been ready. They were not necessarily given the tools that they needed or gained what the experience they needed during high school to be prepared freshmen and or sophomores in college. And so there was a lot of struggle with those students. SAT and ACT helped the universities and the students, even though they may not see it that way, um, show themselves that they're ready for the academic rigor of college. It can act a little bit as like a refresher course over the last few years of material in that cumulative exam kind of aspect. But at the end of the day, when you walk into college, you need to be able to have reading, writing, math, basic science skills. You have to be able to have reading comprehension skills no matter where you're going or what major you're going into. So these tests really are helping students stand apart from the crowd and show themselves and these universities that they're ready for the level of college academics that they need to be ready for instead of just walking in going, well, I'm an A student, here I am, and then bombing out because they don't have the background foundational skills that they truly needed to be prepared and successful in college.
Excellent. So we will close with this. So my last thing is, do you have any success stories, your best advice for students that are beginning this last season, their last semester here at school for their study journey, their testing journey? Do you have any success stories? And as they prepare for their test, what would be your advice?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have lots of students who at least feel like this is their last chance.
Mhm.
Um, Both testing formats give students multiple chances a year to take this test. SAT has even added in a test date or two so that there's an additional chance for a lot of these students. Many students in our area are convinced that the school day SAT that they're taking next week is their one and only shot. And it's just not true. So there are multiple testing dates that lead up to the majority of university like deadlines for their applications. So one of my best advices, especially for even seniors who are graduating this year, is don't worry about the first test you take. Give it your best shot, take it, see where you land, and then go from there and make whatever adjustments, whatever prep, seek out that kind of help that you may or may not, may need at that point. There's always another test that we can fit into there. A lot of students, and I've worked with a few seniors recently who are very uninformed as to some of the different pathways that they can take to maybe get to the university they want to get to. So, of course, there's always things like you can start off at a community college and transfer. You can go to a university for a year or two that you got an SAT score and you got accepted, but it's not your dream school. Well, that's okay, right? You can transfer potentially later. Now, that's not to say that just because you want to transfer means you can, right? You do have to still meet requirements and things, but it's a different process than going in as a freshman. So if you meet those requirements, they have the space, that kind of thing, then that is always a possibility. Several of the more competitive universities are partly competitive because they have a high retention rate and because they don't have as many openings each year. And so it's entirely possible to go to those schools a year or two into your program because you're now on a different track. Or even thinking about things like if you want to follow biology, what do you want to do with it? Right? Do you want to just get an undergrad with it? What kinds of jobs and things you're going to have with that education? Go to a school, get your graduate degree, and then, okay, what am I doing with this? Am I going for a master's or a PhD? Am I going into a doctorate, dentistry school? What am I doing next? Because you'll be at a different university for that next step. And so the pathway for each student is very personal and individual, and it depends a lot on what their skill sets are, what they kind of want to do with that. So at the end of the day, there's always a way to do it. It may not be the quote unquote traditional way, it may not be the expected way, but there's always a way to do it. And that's part of my job. Part of the thing I like to do is be that support system, be that person in these students' corners to help make sure that they can get there, even if they don't think they can. Students who are preparing for these tests right now, I definitely suggest to treat it like an AP class, a college class, a dual credit class, whatever their most rigorous thing they've ever been involved in. They need to put that same level of effort into preparing for their SAT or ACT. It should be considered a short-term investment, but a long-term payout, and with a lot of effort and motivation kind of all bundled together. Most students who work with us have somewhere between 12 to 16-week programs, depending on that student. So it's a pretty short term space, but it's a lot of things that student has to do and cover in that amount of time. So it's definitely something to look as a time investment, a commitment. If you put in that effort, if you treat it like a college class, and you learn how to study for it, you will typically see a very large, hefty increase in your score, which will make you very competitive amongst your peers.
Excellent advice. Nikki, you are a wealth of knowledge, and I'm so glad we did this interview. I think it's going to be a huge benefit to our students and families, and I
Thank
can't
you.
wait to share this on the website and with all of our students and families. It's going to be a tremendous help. So I'm going to stop the recording.